Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Health Babes podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Becky Campbell with Dr. Crystal Hohn. Today, we have one of the all-time best functional medicine practitioners, Chris Kresser, on. Chris is the co-founder of the California Center for Functional Medicine. He's the founder of the Kresser Institute. He's a host of the top-ranked Health Revolution Health Radio podcast. The creator of chriskresser.com, and he's a New York Times bestselling author of The Paleo Cure and Unconventional Medicine. So no one knows nutrition like Chris, in my opinion. And he really, really broke down the ins and outs of everything you need to know about nutrition. So I hope you love this episode. So happy to have you. So you have a great story too. And like most functional medicine practitioners, we've all started because of something going on with us or with our health. So, how did you get into doing what you do with functional medicine?
Yeah, it's a long story, so I'll give you the abbreviated version. I got really sick in my 20s when I was traveling around the world surfing, and took me about 10 years to find my way back to health. And during that process, I saw probably 30 plus doctors in at least 3 countries. Did every special diet you can possibly imagine. Took hundreds of supplements, medications, did energy work, everything that I left no stone unturned. And in the end, the things that helped me most were an ancestral diet, which didn't really, was not really a term that was used at that time when I kind of stumbled upon it. Paleo was still very new. Maybe Lauren Cordain was talking about it, and that's and Rob Wolf, and that's about it. And then functional medicine was also still pretty new at the time. IFM was in existence. Mark Hyman was doing it, but it was like a few people in a room, not this huge conference thing. And so it was early days, but those concepts and the practices that were recommended there were hugely helpful for me, in addition to a bunch of other stuff. But that's what inspired me because I saw in my own experience that there was a real need for that kind of care, that people who had complex chronic conditions were not well served by the healthcare or sick care system, as you might call it. Mm-hmm. And I had a direct firsthand experience of that myself. And then I was able, through the help of others and my own persistence, to get better. And I was inspired through that experience to first become a functional medicine clinician. And then after a few years of that, and just seeing how much of a need there was, and how much that need exceeded the supply of clinicians and people like yourselves that could actually help people. That's when I decided to start the ADAPT practitioner training program. That was in late 2015. Becky, you were in that first cohort. And so we've been doing that for 8 years now. We just enrolled another cohort. I've lost track of what number it is.
Wow, but, 8 years. I can't believe that.
8 years. And I think we're over 800 clinicians from 33 countries around the world. Then we started a health coaching training program a few years later, and that's trained over 2,500 coaches in over 50 countries around the world. So that's been really satisfying and rewarding, just to see people, the message of functional medicine getting out there. I would say that, even 5 years ago, certainly 6-7 years ago, when people would ask me what I did, and I would say functional medicine, there would just be a blank stare.
What is that?
Be like, is that like, oh, so you're like a physical therapist?
Yes.
Or, it would be like something like that, or even just zero, comprehension. And now people just, like, without even prompt, I'll just meet a person. They'll be like, oh yeah, I went and saw my functional medicine doctor. And I'm like, just randomly in a conversation without knowing that that's my profession.
Right.
So
Yeah.
we've come a long way in a relatively short period of time, and that's been pretty exciting to watch.
I had a realtor not like maybe a month ago, and she's like, "Oh, I hurt my ankle and now I'm going to miss my functional medicine appointment." She didn't know what I did. I'm going to miss my functional medicine doctor appointment. And I was like, "What?" I was like,
exactly.
"Wow!" I was so excited.
People just throw that around now,
Yeah.
and that you get in an Uber and they're talking about keto and paleo, and it's a different world, and it's great to see, because I think I always believed that that's the best model of care, and that once people became aware of it, they would start to demand it, because it's like, why would they not? Why would you not want someone who's going to look for the root cause of the problem instead of just suppressing symptoms with drugs and surgery sometimes? Both of those things have their place, but it should rarely be where we start, right? As clinicians. And the thing is, the average person knows that and is frustrated, and like that makes perfect sense to the average person, but for whatever reason it's like it's not the approach that conventional. I mean, there are a lot of reasons, and I actually wrote a whole book about those reasons, but we don't need to go down that road. It's just not the way that our system is set up. So it's really great to see that there's an alternative now that a lot of people are turning to.
It really is. And I love too, Chris, that this is one of the reasons I've always really followed and listened to the things you say, because I know that you do your research. You don't just talk. You have really researched every topic that you speak on, and you're just, I trust you, and I think that that's really important, because a lot of people don't know what they're talking about, or they don't know a lot about what they're talking about, and it's kind of where we are, one of the reasons we are where we are with our health too. So anyone listening, Chris really does do his research, and I love, I get your newsletter and I've read your books and, everything, your podcast. It's all great information.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's just, it's just the way my brain works. I'm curious and I want to understand things. And I'm also a little bit of a contrarian. I even from the time I was 4 years old, there's a lot of family lore about me not really accepting the status quo, and just saying, why?
Exactly.
I was that irritating kid that just kept asking why. And if you do that in this field, you're going to uncover some uncomfortable misconceptions and myths, which is really how I got my start. Back then, my blog was called The Healthy Skeptic, and I started writing about the misinformation about cholesterol and saturated fat and heart disease, which is, of course, now great. I'm really grateful to see that, like, now it's the idea of a low carb diet being good for your heart is not anathema. It's even in the conventional medical world now, it's a legitimate thing. That I know plenty of cardiologists that come into the training program that are already on board with that, and so again, that's a really big change, even just in the last 10 years. So it's gratifying to see that.
Yes. And circling back to diet, because you have a couple of books. Well, your first book was all about ancestral, the ancestral diet. And with your healing in general, let's dive into that and unpack that a little bit. How important, eating nutrient dense foods and what you saw in your health starting to do that when you were uncovering all of this in your own journey.
It's critical. And I think a lot of our health problems come down to the fact that as a society, we're well fed but undernourished. So, we have an excess of calories and energy coming into, through in the form of ultra processed and refined foods, which now comprise 60% of the calories that the average American eats. So the majority of what people are eating are foods that are really high in calories and really almost devoid of nutrients, in the case of sugar, flour, and industrial seed oils, which are really the three horsemen of the apocalypse, if you will. And so on a societal level, that is wreaking havoc on our health because, we basically need macronutrients and micronutrients to survive and thrive. So, protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And that's been where the majority of the focus has been over the past several years. And that's, it's important to think about that. It does matter, what your macro, how much protein, carbohydrate, and fat you eat. That is an important thing to consider. But the other half of that equation, or I might even argue more than half, is micronutrient intake. So these are the essential vitamins and minerals that we literally need to survive. If you don't get enough of them, you can die. There were diseases like scurvy and rickets and beriberi and pellagra, which were, fatal and killed a lot of people until we figured out the nutrients that were tied to, that were tied to those conditions. Nowadays, those diseases are relatively rare in the developed world, but we have, which is in some ways what has made this issue difficult for people to comprehend, because most people are not showing up to the hospital with scurvy or rickets, which would be like a big red flag that would say, hey, you're not getting enough of this critical nutrient. You're about to die. Let's do something about it. Instead, what happens is people have a mild or moderate deficiency of these nutrients. They suffer from cardiovascular disease, metabolic conditions, low energy, fatigue, insomnia, hormone imbalances, GI problems. Sound familiar?
Yes.
It's like what we are all dealing with, but there's never like a red flag that goes up that says this is being at least contributed to by a nutrient deficiency. And then they go into their doctor. We're not looking. WNL, as the phrase in medicine. You're lucky to get a vitamin D test in the conventional setting. Not always, but it's becoming more common. Maybe magnesium, maybe iron, but usually only if hemoglobin is low and there's any sign of anemia, which is the final stage of iron deficiency. Like
if
it's when
they
things
even
have,
do
have
that,
really gone
Chris,
wrong.
I know.
Yeah.
They won't even do an iron
They'll
panel.
just assume it's iron.
Yeah.
And prescribe iron. I mean, we've all seen this, right?
Yes.
Becky and Crystal, and I talk about it in the training. They'll just assume it's iron, even if it's B12 and folate deficiency that's causing the anemia, which you can clearly see by the MCV value. That we're getting a little geeky here, but it's it's rare that it ever goes beyond that. And so many people are walking around with these significant nutrient inadequacies and not even knowing it because they haven't had testing, and because, and getting back to your question, Crystal, like I think for me, eating a nutrient dense diet was a really important starting place. But what I came to realize over the years is that we just don't get the same nutrition from food that we used to. And that's super depressing, to be perfectly honest. Like it's
a hard thing to wrap your mind around,
Yeah. And then the patients are doing all the right things. They're eating well, they're eating whole foods, they're limiting their intake of processed and refined foods. And I really want that to be enough. Like I think, to be honest, I was slow to recognize the extent of this problem because I had a kind of dogma around this of like, we should get our nutrients from food. And, I still think that's a true statement if you emphasize the word should, we should be able to get our nutrients from food. That's how our ancestors did it. That's how our bodies are designed and optimized for getting nutrients from food. And I do still firmly believe that food should be the core foundation of our nutrient intake. But for a lot of reasons, which we can go into, it's no longer enough to meet the optimal nutrient levels in many cases. And it varies based on, by nutrients. Some nutrients, I think it's actually pretty easy to get your needs met from food. And then others, I think it's very difficult, if not impossible, for some people in some situations. So that's why I think, smart supplementation is important for a lot of people.
So when we say that, like what nutrients are easy to get from food and what are not, and why?
Well, I'll just use a few examples because if we did the whole thing, we'd be
I
here
know.
for 4 hours at least. But so yeah, let's say you're generally healthy with generally pretty good digestion, and you're eating a nutrient dense diet with animal products, maybe some organ meats and shellfish. Now you're at the top of the game here. Even just what I said, you're like in the 0.01%.
Right.
But let's say you're doing that. I think you probably can meet your B vitamin needs pretty easily there. I think you can meet your iron, zinc, copper needs pretty well. If you're eating the organ meats and shellfish, you're probably doing what you can get enough vitamin A, the preformed retinol that way, or taking cod liver oil or something like that. If you are also throwing in some fermented foods and you're doing full fat fermented dairy, you can probably meet your calcium needs and your K2 needs. You might still, even in that situation though, come up short on things like vitamin D, particularly if you live at a latitude where the solar angle is, or it's a time of year where the solar angle is low and your body's not producing enough vitamin D in response to sun, or your skin tone is darker or something like that. Magnesium, the soils have been so depleted in the last 50 years that there just isn't the same amount of magnesium in food that there used to be. You still might not be getting enough vitamin C. And then there's a lot of important phytonutrients now, like bioflavonoids, carotenoids, lignans, sterols, things that we know are important, but depending on the range of foods that you eat, you might not be getting enough of those. And then there are, of course, the people who are not at that top of the game, which is most people.
Yeah.
So for example, if you have someone who's intolerant to dairy, or just chooses not to eat dairy, they're vegan or whatever, it's going to be very difficult to meet calcium needs, especially if they're vegan, they're not willing to eat bone-in fish or some of the other better sources of calcium. If you have someone who has any kind of GI problems, which unfortunately is a lot of people now in our modern industrialized culture, they might be eating even a decent diet, but they're going to have trouble absorbing the nutrients that they get in that diet. You have people taking medications that interfere with nutrient absorption. So one example is metformin, and it depletes B12 and folate levels, as you both know.
Yeah.
You see a patient on metformin, it's almost certain, if they've been on it for a long time, that they're going to develop deficiencies of those B vitamins. You have chronic disease itself actually reduces nutrient absorption, and it increases the demand for nutrients. So you have a double whammy effect, because chronic disease is a stressor on the body, and any kind of stressor that we have increases the demand for nutrients as a way for the body to compensate for that stress. And then there's lots of studies showing that diseases or conditions like obesity reduce the absorption of vitamin D and other nutrients and minerals. And then you get this kind of crazy add-on effect where because of nutrient synergy. So for example, we know that vitamin C is required and copper, or vitamin C is required to absorb iron, and copper is required to metabolize it. So even if you're getting enough iron in your diet, if you're short on copper or vitamin C, then you end up being iron deficient functionally. Same thing with vitamin D and magnesium. Magnesium is required for the metabolism of vitamin D. So even if you're getting enough D, and you're short on magnesium, you'll be vitamin D deficient. And so there's so many of these interweaving factors that are all unfortunately working against us in the modern world in terms of our ability to meet our nutrient needs through food alone. And that's why I've just come to believe over time that yes, we absolutely want that to be the diet. We want to get to as far as we possibly can with diet. But then we also want to be honest with ourselves about where we're at on that spectrum, right? So like we all aspire to be at that top level where you're eating only nutrient dense whole foods with organ meats, shellfish, sea vegetables, full fat fermented dairy products, bone broth, egg yolks, like all the things. And you're digesting those well, and you're not taking any medications, and you don't have a chronic disease, and you have very low exposure to environmental toxins, which we haven't even talked about yet. That's a whole nother thing, heavy metals and other toxins that bind to nutrients. And your stress levels are relatively managed, and you're sleeping. I mean, it's hard, right? That's an ideal that many of us aspire to and maybe get close to at points in our life, but it's not linear. And then a new baby comes, or an intense period at work comes, or a physical injury, or something changes in our life, and things
mold exposure.
Mold exposure, chronic disease, things kind of fall apart for a while, and so then it's just a question of how can we add another layer of protection and fuel to help us to be resilient in the face of these inevitable and unavoidable factors in our modern lives. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm a realist. It comes from treating patients for 15 years and training thousands of healthcare providers.
It humbles
I'm interested.
You see it all, right?
Absolutely. I'm interested in solutions that work. And the only solutions that work are the ones that are actually that take our reality into account and don't, assume some ideal scenario that is really only applicable for like 5 people.
Yeah, it's really true. Listen, guys, we get it. Not everyone has the time, money, or the capability to commit to finding and working with a functional medicine doctor. And guess what? That's okay. You can improve your health, and you can alleviate your symptoms in a different way, a much more convenient way. So head over to healthbabes.com/courses and check out our functional medicine at home programs. In those programs, you'll get everything you need to start thriving, feeling, and looking your best today. If you use the code HealthBabes50, you'll save $50 off the course. And this promotion is exclusively for our podcast peeps.
Yeah. And going, we're talking about so many things that we need to be, in a perfect situation if we're all absorbing our nutrition perfectly, right? And you talked so great about those things, but even going back to the foods, like what are the inflammatory foods that most people should be staying away from, like hard pass? Let's go back to that. And then the foods we need to be focusing on, and then we can get into some of those vital nutrients that we may want to support always, right? Because we can't get everything from our foods, right? So let's start there again for listeners, because there's so many different diets and confusion and things out there, right, for people. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I mentioned the 3 horsemen of the apocalypse before. So that was refined flour, sugar, and industrial seed oils. Honestly, I think if people really mostly avoided those, and you don't need to be 100%. I mean, this is something that I think is important. Like the really ultra rigid approaches tend to fail in the long term because they create a kind of seesaw type of experience where someone will, okay, I'm doing a Whole30, and then after the Whole30 it falls apart and they're eating like pizza and drinking beer and like eating a box of cookies. For the record, I think Whole30 is great. I love what Melissa has done with that over the years, and I think it can play a really important role. I'm just talking about this thing of just bouncing back and forth between like super rigid and then just like, anything goes. And I think if you aim for like 90% compliance, 90% compliance, depending on your situation, it's much more sustainable over the long term. So when I say avoid, I mean, yeah, okay, if you're out with friends or it's a birthday party or whatever, have a piece of cake, enjoy yourself, don't worry about it too much. But don't make flour and seed oils and sugar the 60% of your calories, which is what most people are doing. I would say those are the most inflammatory and toxic foods. And then you have, of course, all the artificial compounds, the food dyes, the chemicals that nobody can read or pronounce in the processed and packaged foods. One sort of loose heuristic is if it comes in a bag or a box, don't eat it. There are, of course, exceptions to those rules. Don't be too nitpicky, like eggs come in a carton, right. Technically, you don't need to worry about that. Raw milk or A2 milk comes in a carton. Yes, okay. But most people know what I mean when I say that, right? Yeah. And so, if you just eat real food and you avoid things that come in a bag or a box that have ingredients you can't pronounce or based in flour, sugar, seed oil, I would say you're 70, 80% of the way there.
And seed oils, they're in everything. They
everything.
sneak it in everything. So can you touch base? People hear about seed oils, right? And they're just so overwhelmed because it is in everything. Can you touch base on what some of those are and why they are so inflammatory?
Yeah, soybean oil, cottonseed oil, sunflower, safflower. These are probably the most common ones in our diet. And so the consumption of soybean oil has risen several, I think, I've forgotten the exact statistic, but it's ridiculous. Like from 1900 to 2000, it was an astronomical increase where there was essentially no soybean oil in our food supply at that time. And now it's in, that or another seed oil is in virtually every product. And these oils are highly refined. They're often extracted through chemical processes. They were considered waste products of agricultural industry in the past. And one of the biggest coups of big food was figuring out a way to sell what was considered waste before for a profit and essentially create an entire industry around these waste products. So good for profits, bad for us. If you have stock in Cargill or one of these companies, then you're doing well, but we're not doing well as a result. So these are omega-6 fats, typically linoleic acid, and these are highly unstable fats. So they're polyunsaturated, and that means they're very susceptible to oxidative damage when they're exposed to light or heat. And guess what these oils are exposed to when processed foods are made? Heat, very typically, and often high heat. And so they become rancid, and then consuming these rancid or oxidized oils can wreak all kinds of havoc in our digestive tract and systemically throughout the body. And as you pointed out, Crystal, they are ubiquitous. Pretty much every package you pick up, even with health foods and healthy alternatives, they'll tend to use canola or maybe sunflower or safflower instead of soybean oil. But those are still, unsaturated oils, omega-6, very high omega-6 content that, that are susceptible to this oxidative damage. Now, there are now some companies that are beginning to use like avocado oil or olive oil with things like potato chips or other processed foods, crackers and things like that. And then certainly that's a step in the right direction. And if you're going to buy those foods occasionally, I would definitely recommend spending the extra money to get products with those oils. It's still not an awesome idea to like fry or heat things with with those oils, but they're going to be because they're monounsaturated, they stand up to that heat way better. They have a higher smoke point. They're less likely to become rancid or oxidized. So,
and some companies will promote that they have a low cook temp too, right? Have you seen that?
Yeah. And so there's progress for sure
Mhm.
being made. Um, and, and I think that will continue because the more consumers that buy, and this is what we can do as consumers, you know, like the more consumers that buy those products, the more the demand there will be, and the more companies that will make them. As a
So true.
small side note, one of my irritations, right, is you can find like potato chips that are made with avocado oil or olive oil, and you can find organic ones, but you can't find ones that are both organic and made with olive oil or
It's
avocado oil.
true.
Yeah, that
I
is
haven't
true.
found any.
It's a pet peeve. So anyone out there listening to this,
Send us your
I
Rex.
would pay more for that. And I'm sure there are a lot of other people would too. So, but this is a classic example of how consumers create the demand, you know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
they will produce those when and if they know there are enough people that will pay the extra, whatever extra amount they have to charge in order to sell them. And I think that number of people is growing for sure.
That's true. What do you use for cooking? Like what kind of fat?
It depends on
Like
what
if
we're
you need a
cooking.
fat, because you know, a lot of stuff we cook makes its own, right? But if you need to add
Yeah.
some
Oh,
type of oil or something.
I often use extra fat. I like fat a lot.
Me too.
And so we'll use ghee
Yeah.
a lot. So ghee, I'm sure most people know what it is at this point. It's essentially clarified butter without the proteins or sugar. Even though butter doesn't have much of either, ghee has even less. And in fact, some people who are allergic to lactose or casein can even tolerate ghee. It has a very high smoke point because it's a saturated fat, very stable when you cook, even at moderate temperatures, and it's got a great flavor. Sometimes we'll cook with expeller press refined coconut oil. It doesn't have as much of a coconut flavor, so it doesn't make everything taste like coconut, and it's more
Yeah.
stable than
Yeah.
extra virgin. I am an advisor for Zero Acre Farms, and they have recently released a cultured oil product, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with this.
No.
So yeah, you need to know about it. They are an amazing company that is on a mission to replace industrial seed oil in the food system.
Awesome.
Ah, that's so cool.
And this is their entire mission and purpose for being. So I think you guys would both appreciate them. It's got extremely high smoke point, 485 degrees, which is higher than any
Wow.
cooking fat that I'm aware of.
All
Very
right,
clean,
so-
neutral taste. So it's a great fat to use when you don't want to taste the fat, you know, where you really want to emphasize the taste of the food. It's got a 10-fold smaller environmental footprint than vegetable oils, even good oils like that's one issue with things like avocado and olive oil is they do have a pretty big environmental footprint because avocados require a lot of water to grow, for example, and it's 90% monounsaturated fat, which is more than olive oil. It's the most monounsaturated fat I know of, and it has less than 3% of linoleic acid. So it's a phenomenal product. It's made by fermentation of sugars, and the fermentation produces the fatty acids, the monounsaturated fatty acids that are in this product. So,
Chris, can you repeat that again? What the name was?
Yeah, it's called cultured oil, but
Cool.
the product is called cultured oil, but the company is Zero Acre Farms. And so it's zeroacre.com.
Okay. Very cool.
And yeah, that's a great one for especially for high temperature applications where you don't want to use any of the other fats. We also use duck fat and lard. Some people are horrified. You use lard? Oh my God.
I know.
Lard is a monounsaturated fat. And is very stable for cooking applications. And French pastry chefs, they know something about how what the characteristics of lard is. It's traditionally used in pie crusts and other baking applications because it has a texture that preserves the the flakiness
Mhm.
or crispiness of food. So if you cook, like if you make your own French fries at home, that's one of the ways we do it. We don't fry them, but we will cook, cut potatoes into shapes of fries, and then brush them with lard, and then cook them in the oven.
Mhm.
And those will be way lighter and crispier than if you were to do that with olive oil, which tends to make them soggy. And same with other, so we'll often cook roast vegetables in lard or duck fat, which you can now buy at Whole Foods,
Mhm.
many other stores. So yeah, those are the main ones that we use typically. And then we will use olive oil occasionally, but only for lower temperature cooking, and then we use that more as as a base for salad dressings and things like that.
Yeah. I like the light tasting olive oil.
Yeah, it's
Mhm.
nice.
Yeah.
For mayo and stuff like that. What about getting the specific form of a nutrient? How important is that? So like folic acid, or folate, methylated folate. Like how important is it to get that specific form?
It's really important for some people. It's a spectrum, right? And it's there's like a one of those charts where you have the x-axis and a y-axis, and the x-axis, it would be like form of nutrient, and it would be like important, not important, and on this axis it would be like man, this isn't perfect, but like individual need. And so let's take someone who is just firing on all cylinders, super healthy, has no polymorphisms that impact, conversion of precursor nutrients to active forms of nutrients, and is doing really well. Yeah, that person may be fine with folic acid, for example. Like they may be able to take folic acid and convert that into active forms of folate, and it could be okay. Whereas if you take someone who has an MTHFR polymorphism, which is actually very prevalent, as you both know. And we're not talking about like a few people. We're talking about a fairly significant percentage of the population that has some kind of polymorphism, genetic polymorphism that leads to this. Then they don't convert folic acid into folate, and they can end up, if they're taking folic acid, particularly higher doses in supplements, they end up with large amounts of unmetabolized folic acid, which have been shown to increase the risk of cancer and a whole bunch of other not very good outcomes. So, in that situation, it can be quite serious and really important for someone to take a methylated form of folate or folinic acid, which is kind of an intermediate form. Similar with iron, zinc, B12, methylcobalamin versus cyanocobalamin, iron in food. Heme iron is like 6 or 7 times more bioavailable than ferret plant-based forms of iron. So even if you see like, oh, spinach, that's a great source of iron, because you look at the food label and you see how many milligrams of iron are listed. Well, you're only going to absorb a small portion of that iron, because spinach contains oxalic acid that binds to iron and prevents its absorption, or at least inhibits it. Whereas if you eat liver or clams, or if you're really adventurous, spleen, bovine spleen, which is the highest source of iron that we know of, ounce for ounce in the diet, you're going to absorb a lot of that iron. So it's not only that it has more iron, it's that the iron in it is more bioavailable. Same thing with calcium. Calcium in dairy products is very bioavailable, whereas calcium in dark leafy greens that have oxalic acid or phytate is not bioavailable. And this is another reason that vegans in particular, or other people who don't eat dairy, often develop a calcium deficiency. So yes, critical thing that unfortunately most people are not paying attention to.
Right. And you mentioned some of the things with organ meats and how nutrient dense they are. So what are some of your thoughts on the claims, of a carnivore diet, not needing plants and things like that?
My belief, based on clinical research, observational epidemiology, and the ancestral template is that most people do best with a combination of plant and animal foods, because animal foods are richest in the essential nutrients that we need to survive and thrive, like things like vitamins, B vitamins, fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, K2, minerals like iron, zinc, copper, etc. Whereas plant foods are richest in, well, one essential vitamin, vitamin C, that you can get from like adrenal glands and a couple animal sources, but not foods that people are typically eating. And then all the phytonutrients that we briefly touched on before, those are predominantly found in plant foods. There is some very interesting recent research that the carnivores are getting very excited about, and I think it's a bit preliminary still to. But this recent research has shown that meat actually is a source of some phytonutrients, and they're like not exactly the same as what's found in plants, but it's not shouldn't be super surprising, because what do cows eat? They eat a lot of grass, which is very rich in phytonutrients, and all ruminant animals eat a lot of eat plants. They don't eat meat. At least they shouldn't be. So it's not, that's how they get the nutrients in the first place. So it shouldn't be surprising that there's some phytonutrient content in animal foods. So that's where I would start. And I would say that within that template, there's still a huge range. Maybe for one person, 80% of calories from animal foods and 20% from plant foods is the best ratio. Or maybe from someone else, it's the reverse of that. And if you look around the world, you see a lot of examples of traditional cultures that fell into both of those categories, actually, on both ends of the spectrum and everything in between. I will acknowledge, I do acknowledge, and I've supported many patients in this category who had severe autoimmune disease or other condition where a carnivore diet was dramatically helpful for them and enabled them to go from being like non-functional to being functional, or even in some cases almost completely well. And so I don't begrudge anybody who's in that situation the opportunity to experience that kind of improvement. And what I think is happening, I have a theory about it, which I'll tell you. I don't know if it's true, but my theory is that it's essentially like an extended fast. So in medicine, there's a saying, fasting is a cure for all disease, because it really is. Like if you look at in the scientific literature and also anecdotally, fasting can have an almost miraculous effect on everything from MS to other autoimmune diseases, metabolic issues, depression, anxiety, like mental health conditions, all kinds of stuff. And I think the reason for that is because a lot of these conditions are driven by gut dysfunction. Which we now know, right? There's a lot of evidence to support this. The gut brain axis, the gut heart axis, the gut skin axis, there's a gut everything axis. We use even a gut eye axis, a gut gonad axis. And so fasting gives the gut a rest, allows the gut to heal, and that's why people feel better. But of course, you can only fast for so long, because then, and if you do it too long, fasting becomes the cure for life as well as all diseases. So the interesting thing about carnivore diet is that a lot of people don't understand this, but meat is what's called a low residue food. There's not fiber. There's nothing that takes a long time to break down. And so for most people, meat is digested and absorbed pretty high up in the digestive tract, certainly in the small intestine. And there's very little left over in the colon to feed any harmful gut bacteria or other pathogens that might be there and causing dysbiosis. And so I think what carnivore allows people to do is get the benefits of an extended, albeit modified fast, way longer than they could get from just water fasting. And so for someone who's in that situation, that could be a great choice.
Mm-hmm.
I still worry about the long-term effects of that, especially for people who are not doing it in a really intelligent, careful way. Like, for example, some of the more, I would say, evolved adherents or advocates for the carnivore diet recommend, consuming organ meats and the fattier cuts of meat, and even things like eggshells or small amounts of plant foods that are rich in vitamin C. And they're really carefully trying to figure out how to do it. Whereas others are just like, yeah, I just eat a New York steak, 3 times a day, every day. And I don't think that will turn out well. I don't see how that can not lead to nutrient deficiencies over time. And the problem is it can take years or decades even for nutrient deficiencies to fully have their impact. And so, like we were talking about when we first started, people could be on that trajectory and not even really know it until they develop a serious disease or problem later on that was a result of that.
Yeah, so true. We always find too that people who do really well in carnivore, we always look at their gut, right? Because we know a lot of the time there's something going on there too that is maybe part of the reason they're not tolerating other things.
Yeah, exactly.
What are your thoughts on fiber? I know I love in your first book how you explain fiber. So what are your thoughts just kind of in general on fiber?
Yeah, so I mean, there's 2 categories of fiber, fermentable and non-fermentable. I mean, there's lots of ways to break fiber down. People have done it different ways, looking at different types, and soluble, insoluble. And we won't go down those rabbit holes, but I think the key, one of the key distinctions is fermentable versus non-fermentable. Fermentable fiber is what's largely responsible for any benefits that we get from fiber, because as the organisms in the gut ferment the fiber, the certain compounds get produced, like short chain fatty acids, which are very beneficial. Butyrate is one of the big examples. And the non-fermentable fiber can still play a role in moving things mechanically through the gut, can help with bowel regularity and things like that, but it's not really associated with the same level of benefits as fermentable fiber. I think the reason part of this is so controversial is that for a lot of people who are experiencing a lot of benefits with the carnivore approach, it's fiber that is what's causing the problem for them, because it's feeding the unhealthy organisms in their gut in addition to the healthy organisms. And when they remove fiber from their diet is actually when they start to feel better. So I think there's a bit of an individual consideration there, but overall, when you look at the bulk of the research on fermentable fiber, I think there seems to be a pretty clear benefit. And when people make arguments against fiber and talk about studies that show that it's not helpful or it's even harmful, I think there's some conflation happening there of those 2 types of fiber, or they're pointing to a study that's about insoluble fiber or something like that.
Right. Information overload, right? People get so confused with so many different opinions and the different things out there. It can be a lot. Looking for more freebies and resources, head over to healthbabes.com to get your free liver support guide. We all know and are learning that supporting your liver is so important for so many things when it comes to health. It's a master regulator, metabolizer, detoxifier. Supporting the body's natural detox pathways is important for overall health and well-being. And that's one thing that me and Beck have found out working with so many patients throughout the years. Once you really start working on your detox pathways, you start to see a lot of things unfold and other things start to get better, right? And so over at healthbabes.com, you can also find a full list of our favorite trusted food, beauty, and health products. Use HealthBabes50 code at checkout for any of our popular at-home health courses. Again, you can find our free liver guide and health courses at healthbabes.com. I found too, Chris, even with working with patients who've gone more carnivore, I found men tend to handle it a little bit better just because hormones, right? Fluctuations with hormones and things like that. But they always had a lot harder time when they wanted to start introducing things again, right? And so that's where, just going back to, there's so many factors when it comes to that of what could be causing them to react to a lot of the fiber and, oxalates and salicylates and all these things, right? But I just found that men tend to handle the carnivore diet a little bit more in practice. That's what I have found personally. Do you see that too?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the issue of people reacting when they add stuff back in, there's really no way that's not going to happen.
Right.
And so I try to explain that to patients, like, when you completely deprive the gut of the substrate that the good bacteria need to thrive, reintroducing that substrate is gonna cause some side effects and symptoms. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, which is tricky because people associate those symptoms with how they felt before, but it may need to be a very slow and careful reintroduction of those foods over time. And then there may be people who just aren't able to do that. Right. And, like, there's no guarantees in life. It's like, hopefully we live, like we do the best we can, is what I'm trying to say here. And, there's nothing that ever said circumstances are going to be perfect and we can always get back to some perfect ideal and I'm not saying this without sympathy. Believe me, I've been there and there myself, like, but it's like, okay, hey, we recognize that. I think it's probably better if you could eat some plant foods long term, but clearly that's just causing so much pain and discomfort and difficulty for you in the short term that what are you going to do? Probably in that situation, you're going to choose the thing that makes you feel like life is worth living in the short term, right, and hope for the best over the long term, or maybe take other actions that can help compensate, like supplement or something like that, to make up for the nutrients that you can't get because you're not eating those certain foods. That's the way I approach it in my clinical practice in that situation. For sure. So depends on the person.
I love that. That is so true. And that's what I've learned with working with so many patients, is everybody is so different and an individual, right? When it comes to care and what their body needs, it's important to look at it that way. So you answered that great. So let's talk about your new supplement line a little bit. I would love to get into that. And mainly, like, what I know we touched base a little bit on nutrient deficiencies and some of the main nutrients that we can see that we're just not getting from our foods, and then other drivers that can contribute to why that is, right? But what are some of those top nutrient deficiencies, and what led you into wanting to create a supplement line?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first question, or the second question first, and then the first question second. So what led me into it is everything that we've been discussing so far, the dawning, growing realization that even with a healthy, nutrient-dense diet, most of us are not going to be able to meet our nutrient needs through food. One thing we haven't talked about yet that I'll just very briefly mention is that was a big part of my realization, was that the RDA, recommended dietary allowance, is what we've used as sort of the benchmark for the target nutrient intake. But when you dive into this, you find that the RDA was created during World War II as a way of assessing what level of nutrition soldiers needed to be able to function during wartime. It was not what is the optimal level of nutrients that we need to thrive and flourish, especially now, almost 100 years later, in a totally different environment that people were living in now. And certainly the RDA has been updated for some nutrients, but it tends to happen every 25 or 30 years. The RDA is often based on a formula that includes things like average body weight. And we know that, like, even in the past, since 1995, the average body weight for men has increased by about 30 pounds and for women by about 25 pounds. And so if you were to update the RDAs with these new body weights, they would be much higher than they are today. And that doesn't even consider what's optimal versus what's just the basic level that we need to function. And so if you take all that into consideration, you realize that if we were using our optimized RDAs, I'll call them, the prevalence of nutrient deficiency would be even higher. It would probably be almost 100% in some cases, and it already is almost 100% in certain nutrients. So choline and potassium, according to Linus Pauling Institute, about close to 100% of people don't get enough of. Vitamin D is over 95%. That may have changed a little bit in the last few years through supplementation, but if you take supplementation out of the equation, it's 95%. Vitamin E is 89%. Vitamin A, retinol is in the 80s. And it just goes on from there. It's crazy. Like, we're not talking again about 1 in 20 people or 1 in 50 people. We're talking about the vast majority of people being deficient, and not just one, but several micronutrients.
Yeah, it's so true. So what made you want to start? Talk a little bit about your supplements. I want to hear more of that.
I have some of them, by the way.
Yeah.
They're very good.
Oh, great. Great. Yeah. As a clinician who worked with patients for 15 years and then who trained thousands of practitioners, I knew a thing or two about what I wanted from a supplement. And I learned what works, what doesn't work, what are the most important factors. I also know where the bodies are buried.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's in the supplement industry. There's a lot of shenanigans.
Right.
There's a lot of money to be made. It's over $1 billion industry, and there are a lot of shady players out there. I'm sure you've seen some of the counterfeit supplement articles about what's happening on Amazon.
I know.
People selling counterfeit products on Amazon, and even products that are not counterfeit are just often crappy. It's terrible. They're using the cheapest. The way it works in any business, and the supplement business is no different, is like you have the cost of the product, and then you have what you can sell the product for, and the difference there is the profit that you can make. And so if you are just in it for the money, which a lot of companies that sell supplements, they do not come from a health background. They're not. They have no experience or real desire to make the world a better place and help people. They just want to make money. If you enter that field because you're like, hey, this is a good business opportunity, what are you going to do? You're going to do everything you can to lower your cost. And then you're going to sell it for, whatever you think you can make, and because that will increase your profits. And that's exactly what happens. So they take shortcuts. They use cheap synthetic ingredients that are not well absorbed. They don't get their products tested. They source them from shady suppliers. There's all kinds of things that can happen. There's even been lots of cases where products have been tested and found that they don't actually have what they say they have in them. And so I wanted to create a supplement line that, number one, was evidence-based. So already there's only a few that really are. Number two, that use the right form of the nutrient so that it's bioavailable, well absorbed, and it has the benefit or the function that it's supposed to have. And number 3, that was fueled by my own clinical experience about of what works and doesn't work, and how you really move the needle. And
True.
when I looked around, and you've both experienced this, it's like, yeah, there's obviously some great companies out there with some great products, but there was not one that I could really fully recommend for all the different things that I wanted to do as a clinician. And that was always a source of frustration for me. I got to work with all these different products or all these different things.
It's like yes.
So yeah,
found your favorite, right? It's like in different companies, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And then the other thing for me, it was just how, I've always been thinking from the beginning of my career, how can I affect the greatest number of people? How can I scale my impact? And that was the reasoning behind launching the clinician training in 2016, like being able to affect more patients, and then the health coach training in 2019 or 2018, because I wanted to be able to help people who couldn't afford to see a functional medicine clinician. And then now, as I get older, I'm even more oriented that way. Like, okay, functional medicine is awesome. We're all on the same page there, of course. And sadly, it's inaccessible for a lot of people. So how can I make some of the benefits of functional medicine approach available to a much broader swath of the population? And when I really sat with it for a couple of years, creating a supplement line was the answer to that question.
I love it.
Yeah.
So awesome. You've done so many amazing things, Chris. Like, we are so thankful for all of your work, all of your research, your program that we both did. That was absolutely amazing. So if anybody is looking, I mean, it really catapulted my career back too,
Yeah, for sure. It's really good at like laying a really good foundation of what functional medicine is and how to work with people and teach them how to take care of themselves, and the testing to do, and then what to do when with the test results and all those things. I mean, it's just so great. So where can people find your courses and your supplements?
So chriskresser.com is my main website. That's where all of the free content is: ebooks, podcast, article. We have probably, I think there's 1,200 articles on there now over time. Yeah. And that's a great place for just people interested in health information, education. Kresserinstitute.com is where the training programs live. Unfortunately, the health coach program is no longer, for various reasons we don't have time to get into, but the practitioner program is still there and enrolling people. We usually do a couple enrollments a year, and just finished one this fall, or in the spring rather. So another one likely in the fall. And then adaptnaturals.com is the supplement brand.
And your podcast, right? The name of
podcast is on iTunes and Spotify and all the places that you find podcasts. That's Revolution Health Radio, and you can also find a link to it on from the website.
And we'll link everything too in the show notes for you guys. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We are so excited to have you today. So this has been like a little bucket list thing for us. So.
Oh, yay. Thank you, Crystal and Becky. Thanks for doing the great work you're doing. It makes me so happy to see clinicians that have gone through the program that go out and take this work to the world. So kudos to you too for doing that, and good luck.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening.
Bye-bye.
We hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you did, if you can pop over and leave a review, that would be awesome. You can also find us over at healthbabes.com, where you can find our courses, our latest book. We also are on Instagram at The Health Babes, at Dr. Becky Campbell, or at Dr. Crystal Hohn. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.